Welcome to the 2020 TELPAS Writing Sample Training for Jones Middle School. This training will outline the procedures that we are going to use as a campus to collect writing samples from students. So, what is TELPAS? The Texas English Language Proficiency Assessment System, or TELPAS, fulfills federal requirements for assessing the English language proficiency of English learners in kindergarten through 12th grade in four language domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Although students are graded in four language domains for TELPAS, there are three components that make up the TELPAS system: one multiple choice online reading test, one online listening and speaking test, and one holistically rated student writing collection that is graded by the student's assigned rater. In each of these domains, a student can receive one of four different scores: B for beginning, I for intermediate, A for advanced, or H for advanced high, which of course is the highest level for that student. The 2020 TELPAS window runs from February the 24th through April the 3rd. However, students will begin writing samples on February the 10th and can write samples through the close of the TELPAS window. If an EL student is enrolled at Jones Middle School on February the 24th, which is the start of the TELPAS window, but withdraws any date thereafter, Jones Middle School is still responsible for rating that student in the domain of writing. Therefore, we must ensure that we have enough samples to create a writing collection so that we can holistically rate that student according to the guidelines. As a classroom teacher, it is your responsibility to ensure that every sample you collect is a true representation of the student's academic capabilities. Accepting a sample that is not on topic, that is too short in length, that is scribble scratch on the page, or anything of that sort is your job to stop that student and have them redo the sample. You want to take samples that represent or show what you know that child can do, and you want to give back for completion any student samples that do not meet that. All students enrolled in your classroom will write based on the topics that you come up with your skills specialists. Nonetheless, only EL student samples will be turned in to Ms. Hawkins for TELPAS writing collections. The assignments that you guys come up with are going to be authentic classroom assignments. There is no need to mention TELPAS when you are presenting the assignments to your students. We want to just grab assignments for the students that show what they can do academically as far as writing in your content area. This is because we want to make sure that all students have samples that we can pull from if we ever need to come back and pull for a student that originally was not classified as EL. And we also want to make sure we are not singling out our EL students on side of the classroom to have them write while everyone else does a separate activity. Each student's collection that will be assembled by the assigned rater must contain a minimum of 5 writing samples. Of those 5 writing samples, at least one of them must be a past tense narrative that will be taken care of in their ELA class. There must be at least 2 academic writing samples from the content areas of math, science, or social studies, and then at least 2 additional samples that demonstrates the student's proficiency levels. Students' collections can have more than 5 writing samples. Nonetheless, they must have at least 5. This is the process for how you're going to collect writing samples here at Jones Middle School. I want to mention again first that all students enrolled in your class will write based on the topics that you choose with your skills specialists. Between February the 10th and the 25th, that's 11 school days, each student needs to write the amount of samples that's listed below. In math class, 2 samples. In science class, 2 samples. In social studies class, 2 samples. And then in ELA classes, 3 samples. Of those 3 samples in ELA, one must be an ELA specific sample, One must be a past tense sample, and then one of those samples needs to be a comfort zone sample, meaning it could be asking about the student's favorite holiday, something of that sort. The expectation is that all students write the listed amount of samples. So if a student is absent for a day that you have planned that activity, you need to make sure that you are planning to have that student make up that sample. As a teacher, it is your responsibility to ensure that every sample you collect is a true representation of the student's academic capabilities. You want to make sure that you are not accepting samples that are scribble scratched on paper, that are written on the wrong side of the paper, that are off topic, that are too short or too brief if you know that student can write more, or that are incomplete. The same expectation that you have for assignment in your classroom is the same expectation you should have for these writing samples that are going to be used for TELPAS. In the event that you submit samples into the student's writing collection that do not meet the requirements, the student's assigned rater will return it back to you to have the student complete it again. That's more work on you and more work on that rater, so we want to alleviate that by ensuring that we do our part in collecting those writing samples. When you accept writing samples from the students, you want to make sure that the student's first and last name are included on the document as well as the full date. It must include the year and be written in an acceptable format. It is okay to have titles. However, again, TELPAS should never be mentioned in any of these writing activities. If the student has to write about nonfiction text, then their title can be nonfiction text. It should not be TELPAS nonfiction or TELPAS writing. TELPAS should not be mentioned. The expectation is also that student samples should be about a page long. Again, keep in mind the student's academic capability. If that student is able to write a half page and that's normally what you accept from that student, then that's what you're going to accept for this activity as well. If you know that student is able to write a page or more, then you want to make sure that you don't accept anything less than a page for that student. Since we are using authentic classroom assignments, I should not have to mention the types of samples to not include. Nonetheless, I'm going to go ahead and read them anyway. Papers that contain copied language should not be included. Papers in which a student rely heavily on resources such as dictionaries or thesauruses. Ones that show a grade, teacher comments, or corrections. If you choose to use the writing samples for a grade, you will need to make a copy of the sample. However, the original sample is the one that must be turned in for TELPAS. You would have to keep the copy for yourself. There should be no worksheets or question answer assignments because, again, this is a writing assignment. Papers that have been polished through editing with help from peers or teachers should not be included. Papers written primarily in the student's native language, or papers that are brief, incomplete, or rushed. Majority of our students are past beginning level. Beginning level students are students that are new arrivals, and because we do not have the AEA program anymore, we don't have any new arrivals, but we may have some students that have only been here for a short amount of time. In the event that we have those students, we want to make sure we are still accepting work that shows what the kid knows. We don't want to accept work that's showing what they can copy because of course we know all of the kids can copy information. If they can only list 5 English words that are related to your content area, that's what we're going to accept from that student. Here are a few reminders. Every student enrolled in your class will write. You will collect samples from every student. Only EL student samples will be turned in for TELPAS, and you will store the remaining student samples until the TELPAS window closes, which is April the 3rd. Here is some logistical information that I will send out in an email later to remind you guys. But I am going to share a Google Sheet titled 2020 TELPAS rosters on February 10th that's going to list the names of all the EL students for each grade level. I'm also going to have each student separated by subject area so that you know which teacher that student is assigned to so that that teacher knows whose samples they're responsible for turning in. A good idea is for you to download that Excel sheet and use the filter so that you can see just your students so that you know what you're responsible for. And if you need any assistance with that, you can come to me and I can help you out with that. Um, the samples for those EL students must be turned in to Ms. Hawkins by February the 25th at 5 o'clock. When you come into my office, each student is going to have a folder that's labeled with their name that you are going to separate their samples by. So, looking at that sheet, you're going to make sure that you have them separated that way so that you don't have to come into my office and you're kind of lost when you get in here. In regards to turning in samples, if you are a teacher that needs extra time to get those tasks done to separate the samples so that you know which students you need to have put to the side to turn into Ms. Hawkins, you can take those samples home and use them or go through them on the weekend because whenever you come into my office, it's going to be quite a bit going on inside of here. So if you don't have your samples already separated, and you don't have the Excel sheet in front of you, then you may find it hard to find the student samples once you get into my office. It's not an option to turn in samples late. We are on a deadline or a window, so we need to make sure we stay on to those deadlines. Mr. Pruitt and your appraiser will be notified if you do not meet the deadlines for sample collecting. So you want to make sure that you get all of your business in order by that Tuesday, February the 25th deadline at 5 o'clock. Unless a student has been absent for the entire writing window from February the 10th through the 25th, there is no excuse as to why that student does not have the required amount of samples for your class. So this slide shows what the TELPAS rosters look like. Each grade level is separated on a separate tab. Within each sheet, all the students are listed and is separated by subject area. So when you download this sheet, you can go to your subject area's title and you can filter to just see your name so that you know these are your students that's labeled as EL and that you are responsible for turning in their samples. Each student is going to have a folder inside of my office, as I mentioned. So they're going to be separated according to the rater when you come in here. Rater names will not be input on this sheet until February the 19th because we have to have the raters go through training and all of that information. So on the 19th, you can look for an email from me just saying, hey, the rater information has been input so that you can now take those students that you have pulled samples for and actually separate them based on who their rater is. Okay, so when you're coming into my office to turn in samples for students, each rater is going to have a roster sheet on top of their stack of students. You're going to find the name of the students that you're turning in samples for, and you're going to initial indicating that you are turning in the required amount of samples for that student. You want to make sure when you come in here, as I mentioned, that you have the students' samples separated by rater and that you have the required amount because when you sign that form, you're saying that you are turning in what is required and that you have went through the samples to ensure they meet the requirements that we talked about previously. Some teachers may ask about accommodations for TELPAS. Only students that have TELPAS classroom accommodations for writing specifically, not reading, are allowed those for the TELPAS writing assignments. If you have any further questions regarding that, please contact me.